Aside from sporting contests, it's hard to think of an issue that's divided Australians and New Zealanders for so long and quite so sharply as apples. For Kiwis, it was always about free trade in fruit, while our growers reckon it should have been about pests and diseases. We'll hear from John Durham from Apple and Pear Australia in a moment. The fact is, despite getting the go-ahead to supply the Australian market, Kiwi apples have been as rare as underarm bowling. Dominique Schwartz went to Hawke's Bay in the heartland of New Zealand's apple industry to find out why. It's harvest time in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand's largest apple growing region, and at 60 tonnes of fruit per hectare, one of the most productive in the world. Pickers usually fill 5 field bins a day, each. But on this block, they're harvesting for Australia, and that takes twice as long.
Okay, so these apples are for the Australian market, so we need to clip them all. We don't want to go in too far and stab the apple and puncture it.
Well, the good old Australians don't want any leaves or, as they call, trash or bits of branches. So we have to ensure that even the end of the stalk doesn't have a piece of branch on it. So to stop that, we're stem clipping the apples here in the orchards, which is quite a long process.
Stem clipping is not about aesthetics. It's about preventing the possible transfer of fire blight, European canker and apple leaf curling midge, afflictions which could cost the Australian industry millions of dollars.
You don't want any of this stuff?
No.
So they've got to take that off?
They've got to clip all that off.
Yep.
Apple exporter Bruce Beaton knows just how seriously Australian biosecurity officials regard so-called trash.
Even a leaf that big in a box of apples is going to reject it from Australia, even as crazy as that might seem.
Yep.
In August last year, Apollo Apples was one of the first Kiwi exporters in almost a century to send apples across the Tasman.
To be on the tarmac with the fruit being loaded, wonderful experience.
Not so wonderful, however, was the grounding of the company's first shipment.
This is the leaf which was found in Apollo Apple's first shipment to Australia, which meant that the shipment was rejected. It's only around about 1 centimetre square. It was found sitting on the top of the cardboard in between the lid and the apples, protected by plastic.
Apollo Apples exports to almost 40 countries and says only Australia has a zero tolerance to trash. Last year, a quarter of all New Zealand apple exports failed pre-clearance checks, mostly due to twig and leaf litter.
We will be lobbying the New Zealand pip fruit industry and the government to change the protocols, because the protocols, the way they are at the moment, are absolutely ridiculous.
And yet New Zealand agreed to the protocols, presumably?
Yes, I think New Zealand agreed to the protocols because the door was open just a little bit to start trade. And I can understand why we agreed to the protocols. We made a start, but now we've got to push that door open to have meaningful trade.
In the meantime, the company is doing what it can to comply. It's installed a new $200,000 high-pressure washer to blast any lingering trash or insects off its fruit. And in the pack house, it's putting Australian apple exports under the microscope.
We normally operate at about 12 to 14 tonnes an hour off this machine, but when we're packing for Australia, we have to effectively halve that volume.
Post-harvest manager Simon Thursfield says staff inspectors usually scrutinise no more than 4% of each export shipment. But when sending to Australia, they're currently checking every apple.
And you see our inspector now is having a good look at these apples, but when we're inspecting for Australia, they have to look at every apple through a 3 times magnifying lens with a light. And then they have to look at 10% of the apples under a 10 times magnifying lens. And it takes an awful lot of time.
And time is money. Big money.
Right now, there is no commercial access to Australia. If we were to sell a box of apples in Australia for $1,000, we still wouldn't pay the cost of getting it there.
If the New Zealand apple industry was ecstatic when Australia lifted its import ban last year, well, that joy has certainly dissipated as growers and exporters battle to try to meet Australia's strict quarantine requirements. It's a commercially risky business exporting to Australia at the moment, which is why it's been left to the larger pack houses like Apollo Apples to try to blaze the trail.
Oh, look, the war's still going. There's no question about that, and it'll take us some time to crack it, if you like.
So why persist?
It's a fantastic market. It's right next door. It's the second highest paying market in the world, and we're just here. And we've got fabulous apples that the Australian consumer will want to eat.
Yeah. Anyway, it's the apple we eat from the Opera House. Just see it over there? Up there, the bridge. We don't want to make it look too good.
Last year, the Beaton brothers followed their first apple shipment to Australia and discovered a public liking for their hitherto forbidden fruit.
They're good apples. It's one of the best apples I've had in a long time.
Bean's been eating chocolate and I've just converted him to New Zealand rose. What do you reckon, Dean? Where are you from? Canada. Canada, I love Canada. Canada. Sydney. Hey, and you like the apple?
Yeah, they're definitely better than Australian apples.
I'm not paying you guys, am I? Hey guys.
Where to find them.
But finding a kiwi apple to buy in the lucky country is difficult. Australian wholesalers aren't keen on New Zealand imports.
We don't want them on the stand because we've got plenty of Australian apples and that's what we want, local, grown apples.
And, publicly at least, the big supermarket chains say they won't touch them.
There's still a lot of political overtones in this whole thing.
Peter Bevan works for Pipfruit New Zealand and is its immediate past president. He says the risk posed by fire blight to the Australian industry is still being blown out of proportion, despite the WTO ruling in New Zealand's favour.
Fire blight is a bacterial disease that actually comes into orchards during flowering and it colonises the flower and can cause some dieback. But in New Zealand conditions, it's actually a very, very minor disease. And in fact, if you get fire blight in your orchard, the flower dies back and therefore you don't get an apple. So those flowers that do produce apples in the orchard have not been infected with fire blight, otherwise they can't survive. So the level of fire blight on mature apples is pretty close to nil in 100% of cases. And that's what the WTO finding is all about.
The New Zealand industry also believes that the odd twig or leaf poses no disease threat and has engaged scientists to try to prove it.
We've been exporting, and so has the United States, to Taiwan for 20, 25 years now, and we did a calculation as to the number of apples that have been sent there in that time, and it's in the billions. It's something like 5 billion apples, and yet Taiwan has never reported an outbreak of fire blight, so that puts in context the real risk here, which is nil. We just have to hope that over time common sense will prevail and that the Australian industry will actually see that there are some benefits from a closer contact with the New Zealand industry.
Give it a try.
Good.
A bite. Right.
Away from the political spotlight, the rival Trans-Tasman apple industries are already tasting the success of close cooperation.
It's lovely and juicy, Richard.
Pipfruit New Zealand and Apple and Pear Australia Limited are partners in Prevar, a business to develop and globally commercialise new varieties, such as this red-fleshed apple.
You can see very dark red around the flesh here, in the flesh and also in the core. We've got one now that we are fast tracking. That means that we're taking it rapidly through a bulk up phase and we'll be testing it across a range of orchards throughout the country. And we're quite encouraged by that. So there's that one there that will potentially within a few years be commercialised.
Well, Richard, let's have a taste. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay.
Prevar Chief Executive Brett Ennis says new varieties can be worth millions of dollars to growers.
Oh, indeed, a substantial amount of money.
The breeding is done by New Zealand's Plant and Food Research, a minority shareholder in Prevar. Scientists here are cultivating not only for novelty, but also for different flavours, textures and resistance to diseases, including the Australian bogies of fire blight and apple leaf curling midge.
We have resistance to those two, that pathogen and pest respectively in our breeding program, and we have one of the elite selections appears to be very resistant to fire blight.
My vision for our two industries is that we will form eventually a trading block with the new varieties of apples and pears that we will produce and have exclusive control over for Southern Hemisphere supply, and actually supply those into Northern Hemisphere markets.
So how close are these to harvest?
About a week.
Phil Allison has a new breed of apple that he was hoping to supply to Australia.
So you're going to market this as for kids or for anybody?
For anybody, it's snack food. Snack on the go. These are a variety called Rocket. They were bred in New Zealand by the Government Research Institute. It's a convenience food. So we market it and we put them in tubes and we market it as a convenience food. We're going up against a small bag of chips or peanuts or the little wee chocolate bar, or more importantly, the water bottle.
And how are they going in the markets where you're already selling them?
Fantastically. They're desperately looking for something different and new.
It's going to be a big fourth bite for me.
We had some discussions with some top-end retail outlets in Australia who were very keen on this, but unfortunately it's just too expensive to supply.
So he's taking a different approach to getting his apples into Australia. He's growing them there.
That's correct, yes. There are a limited number of trees which we are currently building up the tree numbers, and they'll come under control of a licensee, whoever it may be in Australia.
So the only way you see to get your apples into Australia is to grow them there?
Currently, yeah. We'll beat them some way.
Apollo Apples says it's in it for the long haul.
This is early days for us in New Zealand. It's probably going to take us another 3 to 5 years to create a commercial relationship and a commercial business with Australia, but it will be worth it. Australia only eats 6 kilos of apples per person per year. In New Zealand, they eat at least 12 or 13 kilos. So we know that we can grow the market in Australia.
You sure that you can get people to eat more apples?
Absolutely we can.
How's that?
Once they eat them from New Zealand, they'll know what an apple tastes like.